You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 27th of November, 2024 on Monocle Radio.
A ceasefire in Lebanon appears to be holding. A trade war between the United States, its neighbours and China appears on the verge of erupting. And should people who sing along at musicals, films and concerts merely be thrown into the street or tasered first? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Isabel Hilton and Oscar Guardiola Rivera will discuss the day's big stories, and our On This Day historical series will recall the moment at which an early 19th century London japester inadvertently invented influencing. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller and I am joined today by Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue and a visiting professor at King's College London's Lau Institute, and Oscar Guardiola Rivera, professor in international law and international affairs at Birkbeck College. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Sounded like I was introducing University Challenge there. Oscar, as devoted listeners to the Daily, like there are any other kind, etc., will be aware, the light introductory banter whenever you join us is usually sartorial in nature. And today I feel we need to discuss your boots, which Isabel can see from where she's sitting. Yeah, oh my was exactly what I said, Isabel. Words to that effect, certainly. Oscar, explain the boots, if you would.
It's very simple. They have a spike, so these are my answer to your question about people who sing in musicals.
They're sort of Rosa Klebb boots, aren't they?
Yeah, I did
you
wonder.
Remember Rosa Klebb?
I do. I did wonder if inspired perhaps by my favourite Australian marsupial, the echidna. That is,
That's great.
It sort of looks a bit like you're wearing two. You're not actually wearing enormous echidnas, are you? That would be disturbing, and I suspect illegal. But yes, listeners, what we have established there, Oscar is wearing spiky boots. Isabel, you are not, and I cannot think of a seamless link from spiky boots to your recent engagement as the person in charge of an extremely controversial prize.
Yeah, not so controversial, but sort of controversial.
It was a bit controversial. Come on, work with me.
It's the UK's most important and largest non-fiction prize.
I cannot help but notice I've been passed over yet again.
We're very sorry to hear that, but just keep trying. Anyway, yes, I was chair of the judges this year. It's called the Baillie Gifford Prize. Alert listeners may remember that Baillie Gifford, the investment house based in Edinburgh, came under attack from a group of activists called Fossil Free Books over the past 18 months because they have 1% of funds under management in fossil fuels. The industry average, as they point out, is 10%. So they are actually doing rather well. But they were available to be a target because of their extraordinary backing for everything to do with literature, literary festivals and the prize. So yes, there was an expectation we might get covered in orange paint, but nobody showed up on the night. Baillie Gifford gave a rather witty and spirited defence of themselves, but the moment of drama came when the winner of the prize, which is a rather wonderful book, called Question 7, and a compatriot of yours, Richard Flanagan, who was in the Tasmanian rainforest and had recorded his response to his victory with quite a good speech, but at the end he said essentially he wouldn't take up the £50,000 until Baillie Gifford produced a credible decarbonisation plan. So that was, the discussion continues.
I'll have it if he doesn't want it, or is that not how this works?
Well, I could have a word.
I'm very happy to take the money and help.
Quite. Yes, I think we could all volunteer perhaps to, resolve this.
Well, while you figure out how that three-way split is going to be brought about, Isabel, we will start in the Middle East, where the news is good, sort of, at least relative to the grim standards of recent times. At 4 a.m. local travel time, a ceasefire went into operation in Lebanon, ending recent weeks of fighting between the Israel Defense Forces and Hezbollah. Reports suggest that it is holding, at least sufficiently for thousands of people displaced from southern Lebanon to return home, though depressingly large numbers of those people no longer have homes to return to. Nearly 4,000 people are believed to have been killed in Lebanon in the recent fighting. An uncertain number will have been Hezbollah fighters. Others will not have been. The IDF acknowledges 73 Israeli military dead. Hezbollah rockets have killed 45 Israeli civilians. Oscar, first of all, US President Joe Biden says this ceasefire is designed to be permanent. How optimistic are you?
Well, of course, the word permanent there will depend on what happens when the coming Trump administration takes over. I want to be optimistic about this ceasefire because we need any kind of good news in the region. Mm-hmm. My United Nations friends tell me that this is very welcome to them because the situation was dire in the region entirely. So this is de-escalation. All credit to those who mediated and participated in this deal. The deal follows the contours of UN Security Council Resolution 1701. And I do invite readers to take a look at that resolution because it provides you really interesting context for the conflict in the region as a whole. And it tells you why and how the conflict can be de-escalated and perhaps even resolved.
But just to follow that up just quickly, Oscar, is there not an argument that this, well, the Lebanese aspect of this war has been the result of a complete failure to enforce 1701? Because part of the terms of it were, of course, and this dates back to 2006, Hezbollah was supposed to withdraw north of the Litani River. There was supposed to be no Hezbollah personnel, no Hezbollah armaments in southern Lebanon. And there have been. Everybody knew there were, and nobody did anything about it.
That is correct, although it has to be said that the United Nations did try the best, and blue helmets there have had an effect. But you're absolutely right. It was the failure of complete implementation of that resolution what provoked this situation. Hezbollah would argue, of course, that they are the only army in town capable of stopping Israel's expansionist intentions, which already tells us about how intertwined this conflict is with what is happening in the occupied territories.
Indeed so, but is that, or probably the better way to ask this question, Isabel, is does Israel still think that is the case where Hezbollah are concerned? Does Israel either think it's made its point or perhaps even has substantially put Hezbollah out of business?
I think it does think that it's substantially put Hezbollah out of business. And Israel is saying of this that it needs a pause. I'm not sure that they regard it as quite as definitive as Biden does, to regroup and concentrate on Iran and the continuing conflict in Gaza. Biden, on the other hand, seemed to regard this as a precursor for a ceasefire in Gaza. But there is a very big difference here in that, the ceasefire in Lebanon has a day after plan. Mm-hmm. There is going to be patrol. People, as you say, are returning to homes. There has been a lot of destruction, but on a much lesser scale than Gaza. Gaza, there is no day after plan. And Netanyahu continues to pursue a military objective that his own generals say is unachievable.
I will come back to that, but Oscar, on the subject of the day after plan for Lebanon, and it is always remarkable whenever there is fighting in Lebanon that the one player you never hear anything from is the Lebanese state, such as it is, which always appears to be a more or less passive observer to conflicts happening on its territory. This plan provides for 5,000 troops of Lebanon's military, and it may come as a surprise to some listeners to learn that Lebanon does have one, plus monitoring by US and French overseers, as well as UNIFIL, the UN peacekeeping force, which has been there basically forever. Obviously, nobody wants a power vacuum anywhere in Lebanon. That's kind of how Hezbollah happened in the first place. But does this sound like an arrangement that's actually going to work?
Well, if Israel has accepted the arrangement, it is because of the commitment of the United States. There is also it's more than a rumor that Israel was brought to the negotiating table under threat by the U.S. that it wouldn't veto a Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire that would have been more disadvantageous to Israel. Having said that, you are right in pointing out the weaker nature of the Lebanese army. 5,000 troops is achievable, and with proper monitoring from the United States, the situation can be maintained peacefully.
And just finally on this, Isabel, going back to what you were saying about Gaza, and you are right to point out that extraordinarily 13 months and change into this, Israel has still not been entirely clear on what they perceive as the future. But do you think there's any hope, and I think President Biden very much hopes there is hope, that this ceasefire might have a bit of a knock-on effect, and that if he can say that maybe he can say to Israel, look, if you think you've made your point in Lebanon, is it not now time to consider that you might have made your point in Gaza as well?
He's certainly going to try, and there seems to be some modest resumption of the talks, which were broken off 10 days ago. So we have to hope. There isn't a lot of time now, because Biden, as we know, is a lame duck president. Mm-hmm. He has, 6 weeks to pull this off. I would be quite surprised if he managed it, but I'm sure he'll try. He wants a legacy.
Well, to Brazil now, a country which seems increasingly determined that we will get to see at least one disgraced former president held to account for attempting to overturn the result of the election that punted him out of office. Brazilian Plod have published a report revealing details of an alleged plot to stage a coup d'etat in January 2023 to prevent President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva being sworn in. This follows last week's formal indictment of previous President Jair Bolsonaro over his alleged role in the shenanigans. Senior military officers mentioned in this newly released report have, as we go to air, either denied everything or remained silent. Oscar, how surprised are you by this, and how plausible does this extraordinary sounding plan actually sound?
I am not surprised in the least. We knew that Bolsonaro had been working towards this. He was very well known, and for anyone who takes a look at the 884 pages of the report you mentioned, well, you will find a wealth of evidence, including tape recordings of meetings between Bolsonaro and his generals. The Office of the General Prosecutor has pointed out correctly that the evidence obtained demonstrates unequivocally that Jair Messias Bolsonaro planned, acted, and had control over the acts aiming to organize a coup d'etat.
The thing that strikes me, and I will confess, Isabel, that I have not had time while assembling today's show to plough in detail through all 884 pages of this.
Very disappointing.
But even the executive summary has the whiff of the Gilbert and Sullivan light opera comic romp about it. I mean, should we be surprised that one assumes / hopes reasonably serious people, i.e. senior military officers, were apparently willing to go along with this?
Some were, but actually it didn't happen because some were not. The army was pretty sceptical about this, and without the army it's quite hard to do a coup d'etat in my limited experience. But, I did cover Latin America, and quite a lot of this sort of thing did happen. And sometimes the coup d'etat were entirely a table-based exercise. How many regiments have you got? How many regiments have you got? Okay, you win this time. That sort of happened. But in this case, I think, Brazil has memories of military dictatorship. And I think that for all the ups and downs of the democratic interlude, people are deeply attached to it. And the fact that the army said no it is credit to the Brazilian army. And the fact that the courts function rather better in Brazil in terms of accountability for electoral mismanagement and claims of fraud than apparently they do in the United States is another credit to Brazil.
Well, indeed so. But nevertheless, Oscar, will this be jangling nerves not just in Brazil but across South America? Because the entire continent used to have a bit of a habit of this sort of thing. It has done very well to get past it and think we are now a continent of democracies, flawed and eccentric though some of them may be. But what we don't do anymore is have the guy with the khaki and the gold braid appearing on television and announcing they're now in charge. Brazil's last coup, I think I'm right in saying, was 1964, but there was sort of a subsidiary coup in 1969 as well. When is a country and when is a continent actually past all this?
Probably the answer is never really. You have to protect democracy. The forces against it are always there, which is why, as we just heard correctly, Brazil is giving an important message to the rest of the continent at the right time, because, of course, comparisons with what has happened in the United States are inevitable. So the fact that Brazil's police and the judiciary in particular have been able to amass this evidence and indict former President Bolsonaro, despite the fact that Bolsonaro is still very popular. And in fact, parties close to him did just win the regional elections. The fact that Brazil is ready to take this measure is very important. And yes, also credit to those two generals out of the three that Bolsonaro asked to join him in this awful adventure. But it is important to remember that at least one of them was ready to back him.
Well, indeed. But just finally on this, Isabel, is it too much to actually embrace this as kind of a good news story? Obviously, it is bad that such a plot got off the ground at all. But as you were saying, that it has been demonstrated that the institutions held, that the military and the police both, mostly at least, seem to understand that they work for the elected civilian government, not the other way around, and that when we change power in this country, we do so when the people tell us to and not a second before.
Indeed, I think it is a very good news story, and because it's not evident that this would have happened in the United States had the election gone the other way. We're living in an age where there are politicians who both seek to undermine the process if they don't win and discredit the process in the eyes of the electorate. And I think what this does is reinforces the sense that there is a constitution, that there are people who will defend it, and that your vote counts in Brazil. And that's pretty important given its history. It also, by the way, means that Bolsonaro is ruled out for contesting a future presidency. He can't run for office again, which in my view is quite a good thing despite his popularity.
Well, to the United States, where President-elect Donald Trump is apparently not content to wait until January 20th to unleash mayhem. Trump's threats of punitive tariffs against China have drawn a predictably brisk response from Beijing, channeled through finger-wagging editorials in state newspapers. Broadly similar threats directed at neighbours Canada and Mexico have gone over about as well, while across the United States, thousands of businesses are scrambling to adjust their orders from China to try to get ahead of whatever may be looming. Oscar, first of all, it's a question about Donald Trump, which is both general but also specific to this case. Do we have to assume he's serious?
Well, it's better to assume he is serious because in any case, the consequences of tariffs, such as these ones, the ones that he has threatened both Canada and Mexico with, would be tremendous. We already know that in 2016, when he imposed tariffs, well, the result was inflation. The result was problematic not only within the United States, but elsewhere. If this time he is ready to do something similar, then it's better than that Mexico, Canada, and the other countries are prepared.
Isabel, the tariffs are being framed this time as a threat. These are what will result if China, Mexico and Canada do not somehow, between them, end irregular migration and the drug trade, which all sounds like things I rather think those countries would have done by now if it was that simple.
Well, indeed. And then Canada does point out that actually there don't seem to be a lot of illegal migrants coming across that border. And as for the fentanyl, well, show me. And between them, China, Mexico and Canada account for 40% of US imports. So it's going to be quite dramatic if Trump actually does do this. And you know, Mexico supplies enormous amounts of fresh fruit and vegetables. So if you combine that with other measures that Trump has threatened, like removing permits to work for migrant agricultural workers, you're going to have an entire nation with no fruit and vegetables because the US farm sector is going to collapse. So it's very hard to know if Trump could enact any of these things. And it's more like it's a bit like a mafia boss saying, I know where you live, you know, and if you pay me, nothing nasty will happen to your house. It's very much in that tone.
Nice little place you have here, wouldn't want anything to happen to it, etc.
Exactly.
I mean, Oscar, it is arguable that for Trump personally, a drying up of supplies of fresh fruit and vegetables wouldn't make an enormous difference to him. But tariffs of that kind will obviously make these and other products more expensive. That's obviously not what he's told his voters. Either Trump doesn't understand how tariffs work himself or is assuming his voters won't. But when they do make things more expensive, who is he going to blame?
Who is he going to blame? And indeed, it might not hit him personally, but it will some very close friends of his. Take Elon Musk, for instance.
Please, take Elon Musk.
Trump has pledged that U.S. tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles will be a place to protect U.S. car makers. In fact, there are already 100% levies. But the truth of the matter is that given the integrated nature of the supply chain of electric vehicles and China's advanced position, a few companies, including Tesla, cannot really eliminate their need for Chinese parts in their products. If they were to do that, not only the agricultural sector, but the high-tech, the automobile sector would ground to a halt. And this is very important for people to understand, the effect of those tariffs is inflationary. It is calculated that the yearly cost for every American family of those tariffs will be $2,000 at the very least. So inflation, the very thing Trump promised to control, would skyrocket if he goes ahead with these threats.
And if he does it with Canada, the major imports from Canada are oil and timber for construction.
Yes.
So, you know, that's another hit to living standards. So who knows?
It'll go fine. But just finally on this, though, Isabel, China is clearly rattled by this prospect, which was doubtless the idea. Is there an argument, if you're looking at this from the point of view, not necessarily just of President-elect Trump, but the United States generally, because Joe Biden has maintained a lot of Trump's tariffs against China and added a few more of his own. Is the US actually better placed to ride out a trade war with China than China is?
China's not without its own means of response. China monopolizes a lot of key materials that American companies use, and China actually can respond to those tariffs with a currency manipulation of its own. If it allows the value of the renminbi to drop, you effectively get into the US at pretty much at the same price, and there's nothing very, very much that the United States can do about it.
Well, and to the cinema, or, if at all sensitive to declining standards of behaviour in public, not. The release of the bewilderingly popular movie musical Wicked has refreshed debate about the degree to which it is acceptable to participate in proceedings. In the United States, some cinemas have fanfared the film with an advisory requesting that audiences desist from singing along. While there is an obvious argument that it is impossible to ruin the evening of anybody at a musical on the grounds that they're already at a musical, there is a wider point here about how folk conduct themselves in such environments. For example, We didn't make that up. That is actual genuine audio
That's
of
not
somebody.
you stepping in a mousetrap.
It is. That is audio of somebody singing along at a cinema while people were trying to watch a film. So, Oscar, the big question, as fanfared at the top of the show: should people who sing along at any kind of musical performance, whether real or filmed, actually be tasered, or merely just, bundled out of the venue and...
They should be shot, or at the very least.
Okay.
At the very least, I'll kick them with my spiky boots.
Or kicked with your spiky boots. I do have firm views on this, Isabel, as people may have gleaned. Whenever this conversation comes up, I think of the one time in my life I was ever going to get to see the great Glenn Campbell live in concert at some theatre in London, one of the supreme country and pop song singers of all time ever. Just one of the great interpreters of popular song. And you think, okay, once in my life, I'm going to get to hear Glenn Actual Campbell singing Galveston and Rhinestone Cowboy and Wichita Lineman. Except I'm not, because what I'm actually going to get to hear is a theatre full of tone-deaf morons singing those songs, and with Glenn Campbell sort of in the background.
Oh dear. I had a similar but different traumatic experience going to see the Beatles early in their career. And you couldn't hear a word or a note because the audience just screamed all the way through it, which I found singularly annoying. In the cinema, my particular bucket of water is reserved for those very loud plastic bags that people have snacks in. So first of all, there's the incredibly noisy plastic, and why cinemas don't have silent plastic, I can't think. And then they usually contain things that crunch. And it's unspeakably annoying.
This is the reason, Oscar, I have more or less stopped going to the cinema, because not just of these things, there is also the people who cannot endure 10 minutes without looking at their phones. There's people who talk all the way through things. It's becoming a thing at gigs as well, to the extent that I've more or less stopped going to those as well. The question is this actually getting worse, or are we all just getting old?
I think it's getting worse. Yes, we're getting old also. But, I'm going to be in these musicals. I have a 10-year-old, so I'm going to be watching Wicked for my sins. And I want to do so without, the tone-deaf people having to hear them screaming. I must confess, though, that once in the United States, I went to see a punk rock musical, Good Vibrations, and when they began...
That's not a very punk rock title. Why would you name a punk rock musical after a Beach Boys song?
But they played the Undertones' Teenage Kicks, and at that point I was about to burst into singing, but I refrained.
You reined yourself in. I mean, I have nothing against Teenage Kicks by the Undertones. It is a fine record. I'm pleased to hear that you restrained yourself, Oscar, if only more people would. Isabel, do you think it is actually getting worse? And if it is there actually anything to be done about it? Or do those of us of more sensitive dispositions just have to sit at home and watch movies on TV? Which does mean we can fast forward through the dull bits.
Well, indeed. I mean, I think part of the problem is that people are so used to watching movies at home on the TV that they've forgotten that you have to behave differently in public. And this actually has spilled over into the theatre, which, given the price of West End theatres, is really brutal. You don't want to pay £100 for a seat and have somebody chewing in your right ear. You really don't. So I glare. But it doesn't always work, but it sometimes does when people are made aware that their behaviour is annoying. Sometimes they quieten down a little bit.
You can always throw some popcorn at them and
I think something heavier would have to be, I really think a bucket of cold water administered by the staff would be quite helpful.
Well, on that happy thought, Isabel Hilton and Oscar Guardiola Rivera, thank you both for joining us. And finally, on today's show, our On This Day historical feature recalls the day that a random address in London became the most famous house in the world. 54 Berners Street in central London is currently occupied by the Sanderson Hotel. 4.5 stars on TripAdvisor, doubtless perfectly pleasant, etc. But 54 Berners Street has never been an inherently remarkable address, except on November 27th, 1810, when it was the most remarked upon address in London, and the world being as it was at the time, conceivably, if briefly, the most famous address on earth. A caveat probably needs to be inserted at this point in today's lecture. There is some debate about the date and or year that the events to be examined occurred, considerable dispute of the extent of the tumult, and some suggestion that none of it ever really happened at all. If anything, however, the possibility that the whole yarn might be total nonsense rather suits the conceit which this lecture proposes to unfurl, i.e. that 54 Berners Street served on this day 214 years ago as a sort of ground zero of modern marketing. The two young and very likely quite annoying men who were the key players in the drama did most definitely exist. Theodore Hook was an author, composer and gadabout whose only attempt at a proper job a few years after the uproar at Berners Street, Treasurer of Mauritius, wrangled for him by his good friend the Prince Regent, later King George IV, would end amid odium over certain discrepancies in the colony's accounts. Other than the Berners Street hoax, as it would become known, Hook's eventual claims on posterity would include having sent the first ever postcard to himself and inspiring minor characters in both William Makepeace Thackeray's Vanity Fair and Benjamin Disraeli's Coningsby. Samuel Beazley, a friend of Hook's, would go on to eventful service in the Peninsular War before becoming a prolific playwright and the leading theatre architect of his time. The facade which still adorns the Lyceum Theatre in the West End is Beazley's work. Theodore Hook bet Samuel Beazley £1 guinea that he could, within 1 week, turn any house in London into the best-known place in the city. 54 Berners Street was the address on which they settled, apparently more or less at random. It was inhabited at the time by a wealthy widow named Mary Teresa Tottingham, who appears to have been altogether unwitting. Theodore Hook then went to work, and quite a lot of work, when one considers that all of this must have been done by hand. He sent hundreds, some say thousands, of letters to pretty much everybody he could think of, requesting the services of tradesfolk, the delivery of assorted goods, the company of dignitaries.
Mrs. Tottingham begs the Honourable Mr. Smith will be good enough to call on her at 2 p.m. tomorrow, as Mrs. Tottingham is desirous of speaking to him on business of importance.
Hook may also have invented the spam email. The first to arrive circa 5 a.m. on November 27th, so legend insists, were the chimney sweeps. They were followed by the coal carts. Then came doctors, lawyers, pharmacists, cobblers, haberdashers, fishmongers, opticians, dentists, undertakers, butchers, bakers, candlestick makers, etc. and so forth, followed, and why not, by several crews attempting to deliver pianos. Other accounts suggest, and yes, we are basically just cueing sound effects at this point, the presence of barbers, auctioneers, poultry merchants, and pigeon loft installers. The Lord Mayor arrived, as did, some say, the Governor of the Bank of England, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Duke of York, at which point it's over to the correspondent of Weekly News Review, the Westminster Journal and Old British Spy.
Berners Street at 4 o'clock was in the greatest confusion by the multiplicity of tradespeople who were returning their goods and the spectators laughing at them.
Eventually and inevitably, someone summoned Plod. Theodore Hook won his bet and /but should have won more widespread recognition as a pioneer of the self-fulfilling, self-perpetuating meta-marketing we now think of as influencing. What better way to get people to talk about your establishment than getting people to talk about it? For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Isabel Hilton and Oscar Juariola Rivera. Today's show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Maisie Ringer. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.